In this short talk, I'd like to explain a few things that I think are important about sampling. So you see this inverted triangle here, and that inverted triangle is meant to illustrate that we start at this very broad level of this population, which is this really large set of people that we want, that we are interested in, that a researcher is interested in. And we end up, at the end of this process, with these participants who, let's say if we're inviting people to participate, these are the people who chose to participate in that study. And this is the data that you will analyze to draw conclusions. And so it's really important to think about these various steps between this broad level and these participants. So let's start with this idea of a target population. And that is this subset of your population that a researcher wants their study to apply to. So we can say that these study results apply to this target population. And we define who that is, who's included and who's excluded. The accessible population are those cases from this target population that are accessible for a study. And so that's something that a researcher needs to think carefully about. Are there potentially people in this target population that I want to study that I don't have access to? And obviously that will depend on your target population. But there may be some people that you don't have addresses for. There may be people who moved and you can't get their current address. There are multiple reasons why you might not be able to access everybody in your target population, and so that needs to be identified. And I'm mentioning here very briefly this definition of a sampling frame. One of the challenging things about making these is your cursor disappears, so now I'm right here. And a sampling frame is a list from which a random sample is drawn. So if you're using random sampling methods, you need to have all of those cases in a list such that you can use a random sampling method strategy to say who will be who you will invite to be in your study, or who will be in your study, depending on which is more appropriate. And then finally, you get down to this level of the sample. And those are those people that you have selected to invite to be in the study or to be in the study. And I think for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about those studies in which we are inviting people to participate in a study, because that situation really poses the most challenges. And that is because when you invite people to participate in a study, certainly some will choose to participate, and a substantial number of people will not participate in your study if you invite them. It's extremely rare to get a 100 response rate. And so you need to think about then who didn't participate as part of that process. So this kind of gives you just an overview of what that process is. So in addition to the definitions that we just talked about, there are a couple others that are important. And one is this idea of what constitutes a representative sample. And that's simply defined as a sample whose characteristics are comparable to that target population that you want to apply your results to. And then the other is sampling bias, and those are distortions. Those are sources of error, sources of bias that occur when your sample isn't representative of that target sample. And so what's important as we think about the issue of a representative sample and these potential biases, it's very important to think about that slippage at some of these steps. And so when we think about this target population, we need to think about what are those cases that aren't accessible, and we need to, and that takes sometimes you have to actually talk with other stakeholders in your organization to get a clear idea of who is accessible and who isn't accessible, so you can think that through and kind of record and make a record of the difference between who you have access to and who you don't have access to in terms of your target population. And then you also need to think about and that pertains then to those cases that aren't in this study sample, right? So anyone who isn't accessible can't be in your sample. They can't be in that group of people that you're inviting to be in the study or be in the study if you're using secondary data. So this has important implications for that sample that you'll be inviting. And then finally, at this next layer, and this is especially for studies when you're inviting participation, is who participated and who did not. And so you need to have some kind of a handle on what that is. And obviously, you know how many people you invited. You can record how many people chose to participate, and then obviously those who didn't choose to participate is the number who didn't. And this is called the response rate. But it's also interesting to think about the degree to which those participants are representative of the sample. And those people who chose to not participate, are they similar to people who did? Likely they can be similar in some ways, but there's likely some reason why they chose to not participate, and that's something that you need to think through. So as you consider the degree to which this idea of members of your target population who aren't accessible and those who are likely to choose to participate has an influence on how representative your sample is and those potential distortions that can arise, it's helpful to think about solutions to that problem and to think about those up front. So I think that one potential solution is to have a tighter fit between that target population and those people who are accessible. That's one thing to consider. I think another thing to consider is the responsibility of researchers to include members of populations who are hard to reach. And that raises some ethical concerns about our needs to understand some of these, what we think of as vulnerable populations, who are often harder to reach. So I'd like to conclude by talking briefly about sampling methods and the feasibility of methods. So your book describes various sampling methods and research procedures that researchers use when they recruit samples. And these are important because they influence the degree to which your participants will adequately represent this target population. And researchers are always limited by feasibility. Funding, who is your sample, what is the setting in which you're doing your study, how much funding do you have to get help, and obviously your goal is to use methods that are as rigorous as feasible. It's also helpful to anticipate ahead of time these unforeseen events and conditions that could interfere with your sampling procedures and your study procedures. And if you can plan ahead, you can head some things off, hopefully by that planning. talk with members of your stakeholders who might have insights in these unforeseen events and track those. And then the other important thing is to track when you're recruiting participants. The other important thing to do is to track that closely. So if an unanticipated event occurs, you're aware of it and you can respond quickly. And the last important thing to do is that as you're doing sampling is to record what's happening, how many people are participating, and keep a daily record of what that response rate is, and any questions you get from participants about the study, any changes you may have made to recruitment, so that you have a record of when that change happened if you're trying to address a problem that occurred, and to also record and recognize those various limitations. All of these are things that you don't just need to think about them, you actually need to record them and have a lab notebook with a record of what you did. So my hope is that this has given you a few additional insights into things that are important about sampling. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions.